Welcome to Happiness in the City. This is Barbara, and today's topic is something that is extremely interesting for me, and that is the concept of power. I occasionally talk about this concept from diverse points of view, but today I wanted to start with the definition of power, the dictionary definition. And medium. Here it is. Power definition from Merriam-Webster. It's one of my favorite dictionaries, but there are many other ones. And the reason we have to become very thoughtful about words is because these days something very strange is happening, and that is people judge each other's speech instead of engaging in conversations and debates and rhetorical ways. If somebody doesn't like something, there's immediately this urge that this is hate speech, or the person is filled with hate. And there's very little understanding that the nature of language has nothing to do with love or hate. Hate and love refer to other parts of our being, to our souls, to our hearts. We can have feelings of love or feelings of indifference. Some people have feelings of hatred, but those are feelings. And feelings and language are diverse capacities of our lives. Logos, language, and feelings referring to our hearts and our souls. So we have to develop the right order of understanding of why in many countries there is no concept of love speech or hate speech. Like today people talk about hate speech. Now, what is love speech? I love you. I can say it, but does it really mean that I love somebody, or or that it's true? Not necessarily. We have to then examine the circumstances of saying those words. What if someone expresses opposite feeling? Does it mean that the person really hates somebody, or that the person got into a spiral of ways in which people, instead of talking to each other in conversations, judge each other? So I'm talking today about the concept of power from linguistic point of view, so that we understand that power is a word, and power by itself as a word is different from application of power that may not be linguistic. So look at the definition from Merriam-Webster dictionary that I encourage you to read and develop your linguistic abilities in a precise way. Definition of power: ability to act or produce an effect. Let's focus on this first. Ability to act or produce an effect. There is a certain tradition of political ways that stems all the way to Rome, to Athens. There's huge literature on politics. I encourage you to read Plato's books, Aristotle's books. All of them have been translated to English. There is a huge tradition of thinking about power and politics in ancient Israel, ancient Egypt, ancient Arab countries, China, all over the world. And somehow this concept got narrowed to understanding that power is only about voting, which is one way to exercise ability to act or to produce an effect. But there are other ways in which we can act and produce an effect that is desired that has nothing to do with voting. When you look at the state of affairs today in many countries, there is huge conflict over the direction of political decision making because power was applied by voting and the outcomes are in great conflict. Didn't create unities in many countries, but created divisions and created very deep disagreements. And sometimes those disagreements are called hatred, but it has nothing to do with hatred. It's a way in which unsatisfied power responds to the way power was applied by voting. There are other ways in which we can apply power to produce an effect. It can be general assembly of agreement. It can be following divine will, which by definition creates agreement. There can be ways to create shared sense of value. And I could go on and on, but you're getting the point that we have narrowed definition of application of power as ability to act and produce an effect by focusing on voting rather than seeing voting as one of the ways in which power can be applied. There's the second definition here is ability to get extra base hits. This one is really probably a form of understanding power as achieving a certain outcome by ways that raise that person or that situation above the level of what competition can do. The third one is capacity for being acted upon or undergoing an effect. So in this group you see that definition is first two first two definitions is considered an ability, but in the third one it's capacity for being acted upon or undergoing an effect. So in order for power to act, to have any effect, there has to be a group of people to be acted upon. In order for power to produce an effect, there has to be a group of people or things that undergo that effect. So power by definition is connected with those who wield power and those to whom power is applied. What happens when there is no leadership? Then really there is no power. And if there is no one to be led, in other words, there is no audience of power, then power also doesn't exist. So power, by definition, is connected with ways in which people interact with each other. And on the B aspect of this definition, we have this narrowed to thinking about power as legal or official authority, capacity, or right. So in this way, legal is a way in which power can produce an effect by certain laws being created and then being executed. Legal power in this sense is often connected with official authority. And then there's also definition of capacity. In modern times, it often means capacity tied to an office. And power can be connected to a right. Traditionally, the concept of right was defined as divine right. In other words, presence of God in a nation or in an empire that created standard for the measure of peace. And that measure that would come from divine right was considered the guiding light in life for a nation, because that divine measure created right. So it was a way in which power was connected to authority that comes from God, who then shows to everybody his ability to act and produce an effect. Today, many people decided to ignore that ability of divine power to influence authority, and what we have is a mess. The earth is degraded, nations are quarreling with each other, there is huge division in speech, people run around in a confused way, and then instead of talking to each other, they accuse each other for being hateful. How can you be loving if you cut off love of God from life and light? Traditionally, we considered power of love that comes from God as foundation for all authority. Now, if you cut that off, you deal with human beings with limited abilities in life, and because they are cut off from divine love, the love that is within their hearts fails because it's mortal and it's not lasting. The only everlasting love is from God. All of those things I'm talking about traditionally used to be the foundation for education. Everybody knew about that because you couldn't go through grade school or high school education without knowledge of history of literature and history of civilizations and history of leadership. And one of the first things you do is you are taught about kings and queens, emperors, and you talk about their relationship to power which they to the power which was defining way of their authority, and in each case it was God or lesser gods in countries that haven't been connected to God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac. So suddenly we have all of those confusions because power is understood only as an utterance that can be judged or expression of voting preference. So it's very limiting, very narrow, and will never create agreement if we don't talk to each other. If we assume that when a person says something, it is hate speech. I grew up in Europe and that concept of hate speech didn't exist. There's something like hate crime. That's a different thing. Because it is an action that destroys someone's life or property for no other reason than hate. But I'm talking about the concept of love speech or hate speech. In my education about language, logos, this doesn't make any sense. There is no love speech or hate speech. There is a love poem, sure. Novels about love, films about love, films about hate, poems about hate. That's different. It's the way the language is applied to express reality that the user of the language wants to communicate. But logos by itself is language. It has a certain structure, it has vocabulary, grammar, ways to connect, huge literature, English language, many other languages. So we'll never achieve love of any way if we continue using that very strange concept of hate speech. I think this concept should be abandoned. And instead, power to create peace and love among people should be developed by creating capacity for people to communicate with each other, and even encouragement of putting diverse conversations together that create connections between people that can bring loving friendship. But you cannot force love on somebody. People who have been applying power of judgment to influence others by banning, quote, quote, hate speech, in other words, trying to eliminate it, in some ways want to force love on everybody. And even God doesn't do that. Do you understand what I'm saying? That people who promote the so-called judgment on the actions of other people, I say it's so-called judgment because really it's an expression of power and authority to influence another person's behavior according to the standard of the person who is wielding that power. So today we have been dealing with a situation that language is being judged in ways that are bringing more confusion and more disconnection among people than ever. And I don't think we should do that. If you want me to love you, why don't you show loving ways to me? If I want to show you to love me, I'll do that. If you don't love me, I'll go to somebody else who may have a different opinion and feeling, but I would not ban you. Do you know what I'm saying? That one of the most strange ways in which people want to create love today is by forcing it, and then to ban any expression of disagreement as hate speech. So what is the outcome? The outcome is that there is now a situation in which many people are scared to talk to each other. Look what is happening in the cities. Today, instead of people engaging with each other in conversations, they have to live in fear of their own lives, because you never know who will be out there in shopping malls and other places who would try to force their way by destroying lives. That's a form of ways in which power is used to create outcomes that are total loss of life. So when we will try to develop ways in which peace can be restored, we have to look at the central issue, and that is power. Control, authority, ways to influence others. We have to examine how we do that. We have to look at deeper dimension of social interactions before we understand why there's so much violence today concerning lives that we shouldn't be dealing with. And then we have to look at alternatives, how to create social interactions that are friendly, that are tolerant, that create a sense of trust, and that promote conversations and linguistic connections, and that influence development of feelings in ways that are not violent. Because if you force love on somebody, you're still violent. So it's a trap of violence. It's a spiral that has no way out. I'm creating an alternative. An alternative is that we have to look at how power is applied, how power is developed as capacity, how control is used and for what purposes. And when we come back to rational thinking about it, we will start developing linguistic connections that will avoid words like harassment. If somebody disagrees with you, it doesn't mean that the person is harassing you. They're disagreeing with you. If you want to create your influence on somebody's behavior, you can persuade that person to your ways, not to accuse that person of being hateful if they disobey you or ignore you. So that's my contribution today to the social interaction connected with ways to develop friendly feelings of loving connections. And I promote ways to do it that are traditional, that get people together in a non-judgmental way, that allow people to eat what they want, to feel confidence in their bloodlines. I feel that we can connect by names, and we can start learning to assume that the other person has goodness in him or her, and we can affirm that we'll look for goodness in another person first, and then we stop the judgment of language, the judgment of the mouth, the judgment of somebody's whole being and life. When this happens, I can assure you the entire atmosphere of hostility will evaporate. I'm very lucky I grew up in a loving family with loving neighbors. I know what I'm talking about. And those things that are happening today were simply not present in my life at all. And it was only when I had to deal with a political situation as a teenager, then I realized that there were all of those strange people who wanted to use power against love.